I think we can get started. Hi everyone. Welcome to South Pole's live webinar session on measuring supply chain emissions with accuracy, the second of our three-part series on supply chains. I do hope that the first session on understanding supply chain risks was an informative session, and we hope to see you dial in next week to the session, which will be the final session of our three-part series. My name is Ajit Padidri. I am an Associate Director of Climate Advisory for the APAC region here at South Pole, and I'll be your host for the day. For those of you who attended the last session, my colleague Matt started off highlighting the significance of Scope 3 emissions and how they're approximately 11 times higher than operational emissions. And what I want to use this session to really bring our focus to is on the approximately. We know that supply chains are complex. We know that from the quantity of goods and services to the diversity of logistics and transportation segments, companies large and small are increasingly in need of a greater understanding of supply chain activities, particularly for greenhouse gas accounting and reporting of Scope 3. And so with the advent of compliance reporting and having a like-for-like comparison between corporations and countries is increasingly important for climate action to take place. So in the next 30 minutes, we will cover why supply chain decarbonisation is important, how accuracy is defined in the context of supply chain emissions, and methods of how accuracy can be enhanced for supply chain emissions. We'll also hear on some real-life examples and challenges in measuring supply chain emissions with accuracy. Now, at the end, we'll try and answer as many questions as we can, but if we're not able to answer your questions today, we will respond after the session. So just a little bit of housekeeping to start off. You are all on mute. We will be for the duration of the session, but please do post any questions that you may have in the Q&A box, and we'll answer some of these during the Q&A session at the end. The session is being recorded and will be sent to all who registered for the session. So joining me today is my South Pole colleague and supply chains expert, Dr. Wan Yi Lam, as well as Mr. Sebastian Pivot, who's the Chief Sustainability Officer and Quality Assurance Director at AS Watson Group. Wan Yi, Sebastian, thank you for joining us today and thank you for your time. Wan Yi, I'd like to start off with you to talk us through your understanding of supply chain emissions measurement. Over to you.
Thank you, Ajit. Okay. Before we dive into today's topic of measuring supply chain emissions with accuracy, let's first look at the definitions of the several terms that tend to be used interchangeably when we talk about supply chain decarbonization. First is Scope 3 decarbonization, which refers to reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the entire upstream and downstream value chain. Then is supply chain decarbonization, which focuses on reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the upstream value chain, most commonly Scope 3 Category 1 purchased goods and services, Category 2 capital goods, and Category 4 upstream transportation and distribution. Then is supplier engagement, which describes direct engagement with suppliers in order to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions impacts. Supplier engagement is the driver leading to supply chain decarbonization, without which no empowerment, ownership, or accountability can be created. Next slide. So why do we focus on supply chain emissions today? For many companies, a significant portion of Scope 3 emissions are located in their upstream value chain, outside of their direct control. According to WBCSD, on average, 50% of emissions across all three scopes sit in the upstream supply chain. Engaging with supply chain emissions is complex and includes limited data access, complex value chains, and a large number of stakeholders. Next slide, please. Supply chain decarbonization is relevant for any company with substantial reliance on their upstream supply chain. These companies are likely to have a high emissions in their Scope 3 Category 1, 2, and 4. I will not go through each of these categories in details because I'm sure you already understand them, but I will look into the next slide instead. Next slide. So measuring supply chain emissions is important because companies need to know their baseline in order to set climate targets. It also helps them to take relevant measures to reduce emissions by focusing on the emission hotspots. Thirdly, there's a growing reporting requirement such as the EU CSRD and other local standards. Companies also want to measure their emissions accurately in order to avoid being accused for greenwashing. Next slide. So in order to measure supply chain emissions, we typically use a combination of activity data and emission factors data to calculate emissions. There are two types of data. Primary data are data from specific activities within a company's value chain and include data from farmers or suppliers. This could be volumes of goods purchased or tons kilometers of goods transported. Secondary data are not specific to activities from the value chain and includes industry average data. This could be regional average emissions factors from databases. So using emission factors from secondary databases may be good for initial scope 3 screening, but ultimately in order to demonstrate progress towards achieving targets, companies should move towards collecting primary data from suppliers alongside monitoring procedures. This concept is further illustrated in the next slide. In this slide, the more a company's supply chain emissions can move up the pyramid, the more the calculated supply chain emissions values reflect the actual emissions from their supply chain, allowing progress from decarbonisation measures to be tracked. At the moment, most companies using volume-based or spend-based emission factors from secondary databases are at the bottom two layers of the pyramid. So companies should ensure that they can move towards the top two layers of the pyramid over time for their material emission sources. This would require active engagement to collect primary data from their supply chains. Next slide, please. So the criteria in selecting an appropriate calculation method for supply chain activity depends on the relative size of the emissions from the activity, data availability, data quality, the cost and effort required to apply each method. Again, it's a combination of factors you should be looking at, and we should focus on efforts on collecting granular data for high priority activities in the supply chain. For example, your top suppliers or top commodities purchase. Sometimes we also use the 80-20 rule. Next slide, please. Yeah. Last but not least, one strategy we have been advising our clients on to rationalize large supply chains or data sets is to use archetypes for stratified sampling. This allows us to take a sample size that is reflective of the various segments of the supply chain, while reducing resources and effort to collect data for the entire supply chain. Firstly, we select the key suppliers to focus our analysis on. We will select KPIs to help us choose stakeholders who represent the highest carbon, water, and waste impacts of our clients, according to the sales or procurement data. Secondly, we'll look into benchmarking analysis. So this will involve stakeholder engagement to help us understand who the stakeholders are, their operations or practices, the current data availability, and what barriers and opportunities exist in their region or market to further sustainability, such as policies or regulations. Then we will look into defining key characteristics. Based on our data review, market analysis, and stakeholder engagement, we can define key characteristics that the stakeholders share to start defining archetypes. Fourth is the data review, which involves reviewing and confirming the data availability of the stakeholders and check for how reliable this data is to perform a baseline assessment against. Last is to define the archetypes, which is to categorize suppliers into archetypes based on available market data and cultural norms, which helps us to develop a customized methodology to estimate impacts at the high-level baseline of our clients. All this can sound very complex, right? But to put it simply, for a company in the service sector, suppliers can be classified into archetypes depending on the sector the suppliers are in. For example, the service sector, telecoms, construction or engineering, electrical equipment, and machinery. For an agricultural company, this would get more complex because the variability of the production practices or management practices of different suppliers could be vastly different even if the source commodity is coming from the same country. For this, the characteristics that are specific to the source commodity and its production practices would need to be defined in order for companies to classify suppliers into archetypes. Okay, with this, I come to the end of my presentation. I'll pass back to Ajit. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Wanye, for that really enlightening presentation. And now, for any questions related to Wanye's presentation, by the way, There will be time at the end for questions, but please add them in the question box as we go along. I'd now like to take the opportunity to invite Sebastian Pivot, Chief Sustainability Officer and QA Director at AS Watson Group, for a live Q&A session regarding supply chains emissions measurement. With over 20 years experience in retail, Sebastian is responsible for implementing and overseeing compliance programs for manufacturers and products sold across the 28 health and beauty markets of AS Watson Group. Sebastian, thanks for being with us today.
Hi, Jit. Hi, Wani. Thank you very much for having me today.
Great. So, Sebastian, my first question is related to AS Watson science-based targets, which we understand were validated in 2022. As we all know, to set a target, we do require a robust greenhouse gas emissions baseline. So could you perhaps describe what some of the biggest challenges really are when it comes to preparing the greenhouse gas inventory baseline?
Sure. So first of all, we didn't face difficulties for Scopes 1 and Scope 2. They were measured within our organizations long before 2018, in fact, which is our base year. And it's, in fact, a straightforward accounting process. The Scope 3 is a different beast, as we all know. Several categories were new to us, just like Category 1, which is one of our hotspots. And typical example of challenge that every companies that starts to get into GH accounting and mostly the Scope 3 is the availability of data. That's the challenge today. And even if you have some data, is it complete? Is it going to be able to calculate everything you need to calculate across different categories? And how do you verify the quality of the data? I've seen numerous companies, external organizations collecting GHG data from their suppliers. And sometimes you can challenge the numbers coming out of that. So verification of the data is also a very important challenge when you get into a Scope 3. So knowing all these challenges and knowing that yet we didn't have any data, we still needed to get on board in this process. We had a plan back in 2021 to really get our targets as BTI targets by 2022. And that's when we met and we engaged South Pole.
Great. Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And obviously, that availability of data is really important. But one thing we know is that with AS Watson, you guys are a big retail chain. You've got over 16,000 stores worldwide. So I'm assuming that your list of suppliers is equally quite massive. How do you prioritize your collection of supply chain data?
Indeed, we have thousands of suppliers across the world. So you mentioned our businesses, 28 markets. We source for even more markets than these ones where we are currently physically implemented. And we have quite a wide range of product categories, although we are mainly health and beauty, but we do have also food, for example. We have a food retailer in Hong Kong. We sell also some general merchandise in markets like the Benelux. When we started measuring Scope 3, the approach, if I would take, for example, Category 1, was essentially on the spend-based approach, which basically was a good way for us to understand the size of the pie and identify the hotspots that we would need to focus on. Through that process with South Pole, we've identified that about 20% of our suppliers represented over 80% of those emissions. So that 2080 rules is quite interesting, works quite well in different areas. So we embarked. So 2022 is when we had our science-based targets validated through SBTI. And already in 2022, towards December, we engaged another third party to help us on our supply engagement program, because one of our Scope 3 target is on the supply engagement KPI. So we basically, through that platform and through a series of webinars, and we continue to do those webinars as we speak, we engage suppliers, we explain them the reason why AS Watson suddenly comes to them and asks them questions about emissions, about operations emissions, value chain emissions, and we raise awareness about the need to measure GHG. There are different benefits to it. For brands or some suppliers, it's of course a reputational benefit because they will basically be able to go and talk to other brands, retailers who want to buy the product. But it's also, in some cases, an occasion to save costs. It's quite interesting that it took so long, unfortunately, for a lot of companies to realize that. But the challenge is are still basically prevailing when we address that with SMEs. So the large companies, if I mention companies like Unilever, P&G, L'Oreal, they are really well doing that work, and they are basically able to get information at the product level. But there's a lot of SMEs today who have never even measured scopes 1 and scope 2, and we're talking about operational emissions and scope 1, scope 2 based on utility bills. I mean, it's a very simple, again, straightforward process. Uh, Two main reasons, or let's say three. First one, which unfortunately we can't avoid mentioning, is basically there are companies who don't care about it. That's not their priorities, basically. Yeah. But there are companies who are interested and want to get on board, but they do not have any internal staff. They have no one basically with the knowledge to address that and to help them build that accounting. And sometimes these companies also do not have the financials to go and get an external consultant to get the process started in. In some markets, we see suppliers not having or not feeling pressure to measure greenhouse gas emission, and that's one of the big hurdles today. Because these hurdles would basically, if can be overcome, would simplify a rest of these other hurdles I mentioned, simply because there are no legislation. If you look at the market where we are, Europe, Asia, Europe launched the CSRD, and the CSRD is very aggressive, very comprehensive, it goes beyond climate change, etc. Is not about listed companies. It's going to target large companies based on turnover and or a number of employees, and it's going down to SMEs over time. So this is basically changing the field in Europe, and we see already some of our own brand suppliers already looking into it and starting measuring their greenhouse gas emission because of that legislative pressure that is coming. Asia, unfortunately, markets where we have always privileged listed companies. So SMEs are off the hook. But who knows? It might change in the future. I've read recently that Malaysia plans to enforce reporting on greenhouse gas emission across the value chain from 2027, and not just listed companies. So I didn't have the details of the legislation, but it looks like they really want to get more companies on board, large and maybe eventually SMEs. So it is moving, but I think it's basically important that companies understand the necessity to measure scope 3. If we look at it on the point of view of a retailer, scope 3 is over 90% of emission, and comes from purchased goods and services, use of products sold, so our products are used by customers. But we are not going to be able to solve scope 3 conundrum if we don't get all actors in value chains involved and playing their roles to reduce that as well.
Great. Yeah, no, thanks for that answer, Sebastian. It's really interesting because obviously you've highlighted the real complexities with conducting scope 3 emissions assessments, especially with supply chains like yours, getting that overview of the challenges of large corporations and SMEs, the overview of compliance reporting requirements that are upcoming in various regions, particularly in the EU, but upcoming in Asia as well. One thing that you did mention is that with AS Watson, you guys have been doing this for a while. Your baseline is all the way from 2018. And so this is an exercise you've really had time to refine and develop into what it is today. I guess I just wanted to ask what further or any recommendations or learnings to share that you wish you knew or had in your back pocket before you started this work.
Well, simply, if I knew it was so complex, I think we would have started way earlier. But although I've been in the sustainability field for a number of years, it's true that scope 3 gained a little bit of attention a decade ago, but slowly, basically. I would say it's a little bit similar to other frameworks, like let's say TNFD, TCFD that are coming. Not many companies have done it, basically, but it's there, and we are starting to learn about it. But I think we are getting or gaining knowledge in the sense that we understand the complexity of scope 3 now. So whenever we see new legislation coming in, we are already starting to look into it to try to decipher it, understand basically how far do we need to go, who are the stakeholders, who do we need to involve in the company, etc. But yes, we would have started much earlier, in fact. But if you look at it in a context of not just our company, but most companies and I would say the world itself, I think there was much more awareness about scope 3 during the COVID times. Before COVID time, media didn't talk too much about these topics, but COVID basically suddenly highlighted the impact of what happens in the ecosystems and how it can affect us, and indirectly how suddenly the emissions and the pollutions, etc., suddenly decrease, and people realize, oh, visually you could finally see what greenhouse gas emission reduction means. So when you visualize it, I think people realize the interest and importance of that even more than before. So that's when you see many more companies basically, I think during COVID time, we basically went to SBTi and say, yes, I want to do it. These are my numbers. Please validate them as soon as possible. What we need still to do, I mean, the learnings also is sitting on the type of data. And when you mentioned that earlier, secondary, primary data. Unfortunately, most companies will always start with secondary data, but now we're working on building that primary data because it's essential for us to get to the detailed, granular details at product level, basically to understand what can we do more to decrease the emissions on a product level, because that will have an impact not just on category one, but will basically have an impact on use of product sold, as an example.
Yeah, great. No, that makes a lot of sense. And obviously, talking about the way that you kind of educate stakeholders and stuff, sometimes experience is the greatest educator, right? In this case, talking about COVID and the impact that that had. I mean, hindsight is 2020, COVID is 2020, but definitely really interesting to see how that visualization of greenhouse gas emissions reduction has probably spurred a lot of companies on this journey. But speaking of really, being able to educate teams and suppliers and so on, maybe more of a focus on the internal stakeholders. How did you bring your internal stakeholders on this journey and educate the team on the topic, and making sure basically that everyone had played their part?
So we've been engaged, I mean, scope measuring emissions already, scope 1 and scope 2, and even a part of our scope 3. So for example, the waste generated in operations or waste generated from the sales of our own brand products or the packaging waste. But during COVID was an occasion to raise even more awareness about the rest of the scope 3 that we basically didn't have a clue about. So luckily along the way, we had anyway a lot of support from our group CEO, our group global sustainability committee that oversees our strategy, and of course from our holding, Secret Chison, who basically also was, I would say, pushing all their subgroups basically to get on board and get not just scope 3, but get science-based target as soon as possible. So there's a lot of internal briefing that needs to happen, of course, because the topic of climate change in general is a very complex topic. There's a lot of acronyms. There is a lot of technical terms, basically. So along the journey we took, basically, we had to find ways to simplify language, to go straight to what we are going to do. So first, why do we need to do it? That's always a very important topic. So today, when we have discussion about any topic related to sustainability, I always ask my team when they present, say, why? Explain the why first. Otherwise, people will challenge you. Why do I need to come to a meeting, basically, to talk about that? We shared our plan. So of course we had to do a bit of homework ourselves through our team. What are we going to do to address those issues, and how are we going to implement it? So over time we developed internal, I would say, documents that are reviewed every year. So the bigger one is what we call our sustainability roadmap. It has different names. Sometimes it's called a master plan, etc., or strategic plan, but it's the same document, and it covers basically all the three pillars we have: planet, people, product. We basically go down to the level of the different interventions behind the targets that we have implemented, and we also identify colleagues within the organization that have a role to play. And we don't stop there. So it goes as well into understanding whether these colleagues have the skills. Do we need to upskill them? So we started already even before we did our SBTs. We started upskilling colleagues. So we acquire licenses from Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. They have a business sustainability leadership for businesses, which is very, very good. We wanted everyone to have the same level of knowledge to start with. And along the years, basically, we build additional knowledge and very specific knowledge. So the on-brand development team will have to understand what sustainable packaging means. What is it about, basically? Then to supplement that, we need also to take additional commitment because by taking public commitment, it brings a different conversation internally. It's basically, we are there, we need to do more, and we need to basically be proud of what we achieve as well. So that engagement is a very long process. It's an ongoing process. We keep engaging colleagues because, as you know, in different companies, you will always have turnover, new colleagues joining. So we need to make sure everybody is on track, everybody understands what the vision is, and what is their role, how they can contribute as well to that journey.
Yeah, it definitely takes a village. So I definitely agree with that. Thanks a lot for that, Sebastian. So I've finished my line of questioning, and so what I'd like to do now is open up the floor to the audience. Please feel free to ask your questions in the question chat box. And in the meantime, Wanya, Sebastian, you can start off with some of the questions coming in from the audience. So there's one question here, and I think this is probably for both of you, is what do you see the key challenges in transitioning from spend-based methods to more accurate supply-specific data? So Sebastian, maybe you can start.
Yes. I mean, if we look at basically category, and as because forest is quite a big hotspot, the challenges in transitioning starts first internally. A lot of companies basically have some sort of softwares. You have data that you collect from your products, but very quickly you realize that you've never collected enough information. So how do you basically go back to your suppliers and tell them, well, fine, you gave me 10 different details about that products, and I want 20 additional because it can go to that level. So there is I would say, a challenge in bringing these different data sets into the conversation that you have with your suppliers, so that the understanding becomes more of a practice. So it's a challenge, but it's not something that you cannot overcome. We've started doing it already, collecting much more information, and in that example, we are since 2023 we join a consortium called Eco Beauty Score that basically works at developing an industry level product environmental footprint to be in compliance with the European Green Deal. And we realize that the data we start to collect will be very useful because we need it to that level. So the transition is always a challenge. It doesn't matter if it's sustainability or something else, but it's more about how do you plan that transition? How do you make sure that you don't jump, for example, from a 20% information to 100%, but you have a 50% level where you can basically start to get suppliers understand why you need that, because you don't want to immediately, I would say, overburden suppliers to make the process very complex, basically. But you need to have that vision. You need to explain to them where you are going, so that step by step they come with you.
No, that makes a lot of sense, for sure. And it sounds like there's at least a step-by-step process there, in order to make sure that you're able to meet suppliers where they can really meet you, because it is, after all, something that is still catching on with a lot of suppliers in large supply chains. Wanya, did you have any inputs here in terms of transitioning from spend-based methods to supply-specific?
Apologies for my sound in the background. There's a lot of construction going on, so bear with me. But I think one thing I would say is when you're engaging suppliers to collect data, I think one thing you should let them know is what's in it for them. And I think you should always let them know that it's not just you as the customer who is requesting for this kind of data. There's more and more other customers who are also requesting that, and also some of the license to operate, some local standards that are starting to require this kind of companies to start reporting their scope 1 and 2. So ultimately, these companies will also need to start improving the granularity of data. So I think to make the suppliers know that is also good for them to move together with you, and you will handhold them to improve the data quality, that would be helpful.
Great, thanks for that, Wanya. We just got a minute left, but I've got one quick question. I think this one is targeted for you, Sebastian. Question from the audience was what platform AS Watson uses to manage all of the additional data from thousands of suppliers, given that it's such an enormous amount of data you have to manage?
Well, good question. I mean, we are using a lot of different platforms. That's the point today. The complexity is basically, of course, every company wish to have one system that can collect everything. So you would have your product information, the bill of materials. Then you the same system basically will manage the ordering, etc. You will know how many customers purchase the product, etc. So it's not possible today. I mean, the reality is that we've already realized a few years back that we need more a system that can interact with each other. What I can tell you today is basically that we are undergoing a tender for I would say a more advanced sustainability reporting tool that will basically not just allow us to measure GHG. That's basically, of course, they need to do it. But if you look at scope 3, we're going to be able to go down to product level carbon footprint. We are trying to get a software basically that will also provide a platform for suppliers to calculate their greenhouse gas emission. Because if you just have a platform where you ask them to put the numbers in, you don't solve the problem of them not being clear about how do I calculate it. So we're trying to basically find that solution, and there are solutions available in the market. And then, of course, that solution needs also to comply, to help us comply with all these reporting frameworks. Reporting frameworks are getting very complex, although they are start to have more interoperability, for example, ISSB, CSRD, but still it's extremely complex, a lot of data points to report. So you want to make sure that at least on the sustainability data, you can connect all that within one system to make it much faster and more streamlined.
Great, no worries. Thanks for that. So look, I think we're at time. So I'd just like to thank once again Sebastian for your time, Wanyi for your time. It was a really engaging conversation. And thanks everyone for attending. Next Tuesday is our final 3-part series on decarbonizing and engaging stakeholders. So hope you can attend that session. And thanks everyone for attending.
Thank you very much. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
You too. Bye-bye.